we're going to look at just the first 7 verses of the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2. But before you go there, because I see you all turning with alacrity to the said passage, our study this morning does not begin in the 2nd of Timothy. It begins in the book of Deuteronomy and chapter 31. I wonder if you would turn there with me, because this really does form, I think, a crucial background to the verses that we're going to look at this morning from the 2nd of Timothy and chapter 2. Now, you might remember in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 31, we've really got part of the story of Moses at the end of his life and at the end of the book, as he is about to actually pass on a measure of responsibility to Joshua, the young man who had served him so well. Deuteronomy 31, and maybe reading verses 7 and 8 says, Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, Be strong and of a good courage, for thou must go with this people unto the land which Yahweh hath sworn unto their fathers to give them, and thou shalt cause them to inherit it. And Yahweh, he it is that doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be ashamed. And what was really happening, of course, in Deuteronomy 31, verses 7 and 8 here, is that Moses was going to transfer the burden of the care of the leadership of Israel to Joshua, his servant and his minister. It was really like a watershed moment, you see, in the history of the nation. This was a transfer of responsibility. This was a passing of the charge. And that is the right word to use, isn't it? The charge, because in the same chapter, if you come across to verse 23, it will go on to say, And he gave Joshua the son of Nun a charge, and said, Be strong and of good courage. So let's just put that on the screen, shall we, so that we see what's being said here, because here's the passing of the charge from Moses to Joshua in Deuteronomy chapter 31. And I think you see that each of these ideas was significant in the language with which Moses spoke on this occasion. He said, Be strong. He wanted to impress upon Joshua the need for that spirit of being strong in that which lay ahead, but also to have confidence in the divine help. He will be with thee. He will not forsake thee or fail thee in those matters. He wanted to encourage Joshua in the matter of moving beyond fear and not succumbing to discouragement. He will be of such strength in thy life that you must never fear. You must never be discouraged. And lastly, as the record says, he gave Joshua the son of Nun, with regard to these matters, such a transfer of responsibility that it might rightly be described as a charge. And why was all this happening? Why was all this so important? Well, it's because of what verse 14 says. When it says, Yahweh said unto Moses, Behold, thy days approach that thou must die. Call Joshua and give him a charge. So you see, the background of this story in Deuteronomy chapter 31 is that Moses was going to pass the charge to Joshua in the face of his impending death. It's because Moses was about to die. That's why this charge was given. And Moses wanted to know that when he did die, the legacy of his work with Israel would be preserved. Not because it was Moses' legacy, it was Yahweh's legacy. But his earnest desire was that Israel would continue to be guided in the way of the truth. And to ensure that that happened, he passed the truth to his spiritual successor. And what Moses is really saying in these words, don't you think, is, now Joshua, don't you lose the truth. I'm relying on you. to keep that charge. Isn't that what Moses is saying? With regard to this passing of the mantle of responsibility to this minister of his who had already been faithful in the spirit of the truth, but would certainly need to be so in the times that lay ahead when Moses was dead. Well, that really brings us to the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 28. And some of you will know that the last few chapters of the first of Chronicles from chapter 22 right through to the end, are part of what might be described as the last words of David, a marvelous study in their own right. When David was an old man and full of days, all of these things happened. 1 Chronicles 22, right through to chapter 29. But I draw your attention to what happens in the middle of David's final speech. It begins in 1 Chronicles 28, it runs right through into chapter 29. But in the middle of it, he says these words in the 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 20. David said to Solomon his son, "Be strong and of good courage and do it. Fear not, nor be dismayed, for Yahweh Elohim, even my Elohim, will be with thee. He will not fail thee nor forsake thee until thou hast finished all the work for the service of the house of Yahweh." And we suddenly realize, if we just put those on the screen here, this is obviously the charge being passed from David to Solomon. As we look at those words in the 1 of Chronicles chapter 28, we realize, well, where do they all come from? This is all the language. They're not David's words, not originally. The very terms that David used to instruct his son are taken from the earlier episode of Deuteronomy chapter 31 and the passing of the charge from Moses to Joshua. Now, do you think David was conscious of that in his choice of words? I'm certain he was, brothers and sisters. David realized what he was saying when he spoke these words to Solomon. He was quoting from Moses, you see. And why was all this happening at this moment in David's life? Well, we know why, because if you come to the 1st of Kings and chapter 2, we're told exactly why this charge was passed on in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 28, in the same language, with the same expressions as Moses had once used. What brought all this about in David's life and circumstance at this time? Well, the 1st of Kings chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2 says, "Now the days of David drew nigh that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong therefore, and show thyself a man, and keep the charge." Oh, now where do those words come from, you see? All of these phrases, all of these expressions, be strong, fear not, be not dismayed, he will not fail thee nor forsake thee, keep the charge. Every one of these expressions that David deliberately uses to pass on responsibility to his son Solomon are drawn from the words of Moses on an earlier occasion. But the circumstance is the same, is it not, brothers and sisters? You see, an old man was about to die, and David's going to pass on that mantle of responsibility for the guardianship of the heritage of the truth. And he was anxious to ensure that that heritage would be preserved in the generation to come. So this was David's charge to Solomon, but he will pattern himself on an earlier man of God, and he'll use the same expressions. Now ask yourself this question, brothers and sisters: why was David so careful to use the expressions of Moses in passing on the charge to Solomon? And I think the obvious answer is because he believed that what he was passing on to Solomon was the same charge that Moses had passed on to Joshua. And he saluted that thought by using the same language. And what he was really saying was, Solomon, I'm counting on you to keep the truth, to guard it that it be not lost. I'm depending on you now, he says. And there's a continuum of thinking here, you see, about Yahweh's principles and Yahweh's heritage. Well, now we can, now we may, now we shall turn to the 2nd of Timothy in chapter 2. And because now suddenly, when we come to the verses for our consideration this morning, the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2 and verses 1 to 7, well, what we've got here obviously is an echo, a marvellous echo, an echo of all of this that we've seen in these two earlier passages. Here's the drama of the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2. So you see how it begins? Verse 1. Thou therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And you think, oh, where did Paul get those words from? Why would he have used that particular expression? What thinkest thou? Now, just have a look at this on the screen, brothers and sisters, because here's a collage of phrases from the epistle of Paul to Timothy, from the 2nd epistle in particular. And I draw to your attention that the very terminology that Paul will use in this epistle has clearly come from the same source as the past. So here in the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, Thou therefore, my son, be strong. And later on in chapter 4, he will remind Timothy that God can do all things. God will not fail thee. God will not forsake thee. He's able to deliver. He will preserve. He will be with you, is the promise of Paul to Timothy. And he will also go on to say to Timothy in the first chapter, as we've already seen, God has not given us the spirit of fear. Be not therefore ashamed. Fear not, neither be dismayed. Fear not, neither be discouraged, said Moses to Joshua and David to Solomon. And Paul will say the identical thing to Timothy. Do not fear, do not be dismayed. And I give thee this charge before God, he says in chapter 4, verse 1. And we suddenly realize that the language of this last letter, no mistaking the tenor of the languages there or the source of the words. Paul's quoting from Moses and David. And why was all this happening in the 2nd of Timothy? Well, because of chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6, which says, For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. An old man was about to die. And just as Moses had said, or been told, thy days approach that thou must die, and just as David had said, I go the way of all the earth, so now Paul will say, the time of my departure is at hand. See, the circumstances are exactly the same, are they not? The heritage of the truth is about to be passed on by the apostle to this young man. No wonder the Spirit overshadowed the writing of all these things, so that what we've got here is the language of succession. And this is really the dramatic background to the words of Paul in the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2. And he quoted from Moses and from David because he believed he was passing on the same charge. And that's the thing, brothers and sisters. You see, there's a link between every generation of the truth. What's being passed on is the same heritage. And that's exactly how the apostle felt on this occasion. Well, let's take up the words then, shall we, in this second chapter, and just have the time to reflect upon the fullness of what the apostle says in these first 7 verses. Interesting, actually, because you see what he says, verse 1, Thou therefore, my son, be strong. And there was no doubt where the words had come from, and perhaps that very context of the words is the key to their proper interpretation. Do you know, we're told in Exodus chapter 33 and verse 11 that Joshua was described as a young man. And we're told when David gave Solomon charge, we're expressly told that David describes him in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 29 as young and tender. And now Paul will place the mantle of responsibility on the shoulder of Timothy, of whom he will say in the 1st of Timothy chapter 4 verse 12, "Let no man despise thy youth." An old man is passing on the charge to a young man, and each of these young men would need to face the tremendous burden of the challenges of preserving and guarding the truth in their own generation, but without the guidance of the mentor whom once they had had, but who would soon be gone. And in their times of loneliness, in their times of despair, this charge would ring in their ears: "He will be with thee. He will not forsake thee. He will be with thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed." And as Paul opens this appeal in the 2nd chapter, don't you feel all of Paul's love poured into this farewell, into his dear son in the faith? I can feel all of Paul's heart in those words to Timothy. Timothy would know where Paul had taken his words from, and it was a call to the guardianship of the truth itself. Timothy knew that. It was a promise to Timothy that even when Paul was gone, God would be with him. "I want you to know that," says Paul to this young man. You see, here's the thing, brothers and sisters. We don't ever know whether Timothy got there. By the way, I believe he did, but I can't prove it, of course. But if he never got there, if he never made it, Paul needed to know that he told Timothy these things. That whether they saw each other in person, Paul needed in his own heart to know that he'd given this counsel to the young man: "God will be with thee. Now guard the truth with all your might. And do it," he says, verse 1, "in the grace that is in Christ Jesus." So you see, Paul's words were not that Timothy should be strong in his own self-reliance, but in the grace already given him in Christ Jesus. And that grace would be sufficient for his needs because, in the words of another passage, Christ's strength would be made perfect in Timothy's weakness. And if only Timothy could believe in that and surrender to the power of Christ in his life, all things would be made possible, even after Paul had gone. And so he says, 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, he says, "The things which thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also." You see, Timothy wasn't just being asked by Paul here to guard the truth in his own life. It wasn't just about Timothy guarding the heritage for himself. Because Paul knew that his own time was almost ended, he gave counsel to provide for the succession of the truth itself. And that succession would occur if there was a faithful passing on of true apostolic teaching. And Timothy was being asked to do that, to preach the truth of the gospel with undaunted courage, but also, notice, to ensure its perpetuation by committing those truths to other faithful men such as he. Timothy had heard the gospel from the apostle's own mouth. He knew it well. But there were others also, incidentally, who'd witnessed to the teaching of the Apostle Paul. There were others that Timothy could confer with, other witnesses that could sharpen Timothy's recollection of apostolic counsel. But the crucial thing is, and what Paul says is, he says, "I want you, Timothy, to make sure that you commit those things to faithful men who shall be able to teach others." So there were two critical things that these men needed to have. Do you notice? They must be faithful to the truth in their own lives, but they must be capable of carefully and thoroughly teaching it to others. Find those ones, says Paul to Timothy. Find those who live the truth. Find those who can teach the truth. And when you do, commit those matters to them. It's a lovely word, by the way. You see that word commit in verse 2. It means literally to entrust something to another for safekeeping. What a lovely word. To entrust something to another for safekeeping. That's exactly how the apostle felt. And so Rotherham says, the same entrust thou unto faithful men, such as shall be competent to teach others also. And by the way, brothers and sisters, the truth has ever needed such men. Those who can take the truth and break it small and give the sense and cause others to understand it. And when you think about verse 2, you see what the apostle is really asking Timothy to do from the outset of accepting responsibility. What he really says is, Timothy, I want you to think beyond yourself. Not only beyond yourself in terms of those around you and the ecclesial world around you, but I want you to think beyond your own time. Beyond the limitations of your own mortal frame. Think larger, Timothy. Think about the truth itself and its perpetuation. Beyond your ecclesia and beyond your lifetime. Have a wider canvas of thinking. You know, brothers and sisters, that's how all of us should think about the truth. We sometimes imagine that we have difficulties in our own ecclesia. We will do this or thus or so. And we forget that whatever we decide to do in our ecclesias, we do on behalf of the entire community of the saints worldwide. Your ecclesia is not in isolation. If you decide to disfellowship a person or to fellowship a person, you do that on behalf of the entire body of Christ. Not just on behalf of your ecclesia. Every single thing we do must be with that outward thinking that the apostle urges Timothy to have in his mindset here is what will be best for the truth isn't just our little cosmos where we meet. It's about how the truth itself might best be guarded in every place. So the question was, with what spirit then should Timothy seek to accomplish this task? How ought he to be strong in going about this work that the apostle had laid upon him? And the answer is that the apostle Paul will now give Timothy 3 metaphors to explain what being strong really means. He'll give him the metaphor of the soldier in verses 3 and 4. He'll give the metaphor of the athlete in verse 5, and he'll give the metaphor of the farmer in verse 6. And you see, each of these was chosen to give further detail on how Timothy would need to be strong in safeguarding and preserving the truth. But the common thread with all 3 metaphors is that success would depend upon total dedication. Now, I want you just to stop for a moment, brothers and sisters, and to just think about how thoughtful these metaphors were that the Apostle Paul provides to Timothy for counsel at this moment of time. You see, the figure of the soldier was drawn from the military might of the Roman army. The figure of the athlete was drawn from the excellence of the Greek games. And the figure of the farmer was drawn from the pastoral cycle of the Jewish calendar. There was something universal about these 3 ideas, you see. And the Greek suggests that Paul was asking him to join he, the apostle, on this journey with regard to these metaphors. Because when he says in verse 3, thou therefore endure hardness, the ASV says, suffer with me. Rotherham says, take thy part in suffering hardship. The Revised Standard Version says, share in the suffering. It was a reaffirmation really of chapter 1 and verse 8. Be thou a partaker of the afflictions of the gospel. And what Paul was saying is that the truth would bring difficulty into Timothy's life. A measure of suffering, perhaps even persecution. But Paul asked him to accept the burden for the truth's sake. But he used a word that suggested that what Timothy was really being asked to do was to join he, the apostle. I've already gone on this journey, he says. I ask you to join me now. Be a soldier, he says. A good soldier. Now you see, the life of a soldier was a life of commitment to a cause that was greater than themselves. And that's exactly what the truth is, brothers and sisters. It's a cause greater than us. And from the soldier, Timothy must learn the principle of endurance in coming to spiritual maturity in his own life. And what the apostle says about soldierhood is this, verse 4, "No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier." So you see, the thing is that in the Roman army, a soldier was already considered to have a career. If you were a soldier, you were already committed to a career of soldierhood. And therefore, the Roman soldier was not permitted to engage in husbandry or merchandise or mechanical employment whilst engaged in active service. Civilian activities were forbidden to the soldier. Why? Because they would divert the soldier from the single-minded objective he must have at all times. Anything that would distract from the noble aims of his calling were considered to be, in the words of this verse, an entanglement. The word means to braid or to weave together. So the Revised Standard Version says, "No soldier on service gets entangled in civilian pursuits." What a marvelous expression when you think about it, for the life and the age and the times in which we live. We live, brothers and sisters, in an age of worldly entanglement. That's precisely what life is like. We're entangled with 1,000 different things. That's the challenge, you see, of the truth. But the soldier doesn't do that, says Paul to Timothy. He mustn't do that. Anything that would distract from the noble aims of his calling are an entanglement. What's the one thing he must be left free to pursue, the soldier? Well, verse 4 says, "that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier." So you see, the service of a captain and the honour of a cause were everything to a good soldier. They transcended all else. The sole aim of a soldier was to please the one who had enlisted him. And that captain is Christ, you see. And the thing about the soldier, brothers and sisters, and the wonder of its metaphor is that what it taught was this: it's not about personal success. It's about communal victory. And we live in an age so given over to individual liberty and personal success and self-importance that we forget the significance of this metaphor. It's about communal victory. The soldier fought for his cause and for the honour of his commanding officer. All else is entanglement, says the Apostle Paul. And yet our lives get caught up with so many other activities, so many other devices, that the question of who our captain is and what our cause is can sometimes be lost. Oh, that was sharp, wasn't it? The focus that Paul brings Timothy back to in that first metaphor. You serve your commanding officer, he says, and think of nothing else till victory be won. And Paul, in that metaphor, was uncompromising, of course, in warning Timothy what the truth would demand. He didn't pretend the truth would be easy. He didn't suggest the way would be smooth. It will be hard, he said. It will be difficult. It will be challenging. But the cause is of such transcendent importance that you must commit to it 100%, he says. Now go be a good soldier. Marvellous, really. Just so crisp. But then he says, verse 5, and there was wisdom in the enriching of the ideas with a separate and quite different metaphor, where the apostle says in verse 5, and he says, if a man also strive for masteries, yet he's not crowned except he strive lawfully. And this time, the word strive is the Greek word athleo, and refers to the contestant who strove for success in the Grecian games. And so the American Standard Version says, if also a man contend in the games. So it's the metaphor of the athlete now that Paul will use. You see, there was a strict honour for competition in the games, in the Greek games. Every athlete had to take an oath that they had spent at least 10 months in preparation before the games commenced, that they had been so committed to their regimen of exercise that they'd been 10 months getting ready for the importance of the games. An oath that they had done so. Well, brothers and sisters, are we all prepared to take an oath of the preparation that we've given for the race to come? And not only that, but they had to also give an oath that they would strive only according to the rules of the games, and they were strictly enforced. Any tricks or stratagems were regarded as acts of disloyalty to the athlete's code, and they would result in disqualification. There was to be no cheating in the games. That was absolutely forbidden. So to be an athlete that might be successful required absolutely rigorous training and dedicated preparation. And all this for what? For a Stephanos, for a laurel wreath, a crown of leaves that would fade away. Why would you prepare for so long? Strive for so long for a set of leaves that would wither? And the answer is, you see, because it wasn't about the leaves, it wasn't about the Stephanos wreath, was it? It was about the honour associated with winning the wreath that counted. The honour of winning that was that which they strove for. And so Timothy was being exhorted here to be well prepared and scrupulously honest in all his dealings in the truth. Do you know, that metaphor still has, I think, significant application for life in the truth today. Too oft there are things that happen even in ecclesial life where it's done with less than honourable integrity. The art of politics is not unknown in ecclesial life. The art of subterfuge, the art of concealment. And yet there's never any justification for any cheating or compromise so common in the world to do what will be best for the truth. The truth has got its own code of honour, and the spirit of the truth requires that we always live our lives, even in the most stressful of ecclesial things, by the integrity of Christ. So the Revised Standard Version says, an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. Well, there are rules, brothers and sisters, rules of honourable behaviour. And to win as an athlete required above all else the spirit of complete discipline. Paul says to Timothy, you'll need this. And then, verse 6, he says, the husbandman that laboureth must be first partaker of the fruits. Now, in the authorized version, it suggests that the point of the metaphor is that the husbandman is he who first partakes or enjoys of the benefit of the fruits when they come. And I suppose there's truth in that. The farmer's the first to taste the crop on every occasion. But I don't think that's the force of the metaphor on this occasion. I think the point of this metaphor in verse 6 relates to the diligence that he must first show if there is to be any harvest at all. So just 3 passages that perhaps are good cross-references to that metaphor. Proverbs 20 verse 4 says, the sluggard will not plough by reason of the cold, therefore shall he beg and harvest and have nothing. If a farmer says it's too cold to plough, there'll be no harvest. He's got to be diligent in the face of cold. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 4 says, "He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap." If a farmer says, "Oh, it's blowing today, perhaps we won't sow," there'll be no harvest. If the farmer says, "Oh, clouds today, there could be rain, perhaps we better not reap," there'll be no harvest. Farmers have to exercise diligence no matter whether the circumstances appear to be propitious or not. In fact, most often they're not. Which, by the way, is true of life itself. Sometimes the very things that we need do, that we must do in the truth's sake, don't come at the perfect time. In fact, they'll generally come at the most difficult time. But good farmers go out and sow in anticipation of harvests anyway. James 5 verse 7 says, "Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it until he receive the early and latter rain." In fact, you see what the margin says in verse 6? Well, at least the margin of my Bible says, "The husbandman labouring first must be partaker of the fruits." And I think that's the real force of the metaphor here. This is what a farmer does. He labours, he toils, he works to plough, to sow, to nurture, long before any fruits are possible. He sleeps, he rises night and day and night, until finally the fruit is brought forth, and he puts forth the sickle because the harvest has come. But it has only come, brothers and sisters, that harvest, because he has laboured. So being strong in the truth required the spirit of nurture with great patience, and always with an eye toward fruit for the honour of God. And then the apostle says, verse 7, he says, "Consider what I say, and the Lord give thee understanding in all things." And that word "consider" in verse 7 means literally to ponder. So you see, Paul had given these metaphors to focus Timothy's mind on the three ways in which he must show himself to be strong for the guarding of the heritage of the truth. And I think what he's asking Timothy to do in this verse, he says, you think about this. I want you to go away and think about what I've just told you. I want you to extract the meaning of these metaphors by pondering on them, he says. You go away and think about what I've just said, Timothy. Oh, and by the way, when he says this, "and the Lord give thee understanding in all things," I don't think that he means go away and think about it, and I hope that God might bless you with understanding, or I trust that he might. No. In the Greek, the manuscripts render that phrase in the imperative tense. So the New International Version says, "Reflect on what I am saying, for the Lord will give thee insight into all this." Or Rotherham says, "Think as to what I'm speaking, for the Lord will give thee discernment in all things." So what Paul was saying was, Timothy, you need to ponder the fullness of these metaphors and learn how to use them in your work. But if Timothy was prepared to meditate upon their secrets, he would be blessed with sound insight, and he would be given the right judgment on how best to apply them. And here's the thing, brothers and sisters, I think here's the lesson of the 2nd of Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. The reality was that Timothy was going to need to use all three. How might we be strong in the truth? Well, let's have a look, shall we? Let's summarize the implications of the metaphors. "Thou therefore, my son, be strong." Well, says Paul to Timothy, in situations which required courage and endurance, the soldier would teach Timothy to be strong in the spirit of absolute loyalty, since the soldier fights for his commander. You'll need to be strong that way, Timothy, says Paul. But there will be other circumstances and other occasions, situations that will require effort and excellence, where the athlete would teach Timothy to be strong in the spirit of complete discipline, since the athlete strives for himself. And there would be yet other circumstances in ecclesial life which would require nurture and perseverance. And the farmer would teach Timothy to be strong in the spirit of patient labour, since the farmer toils for others. You need to be strong in all these ways, my son, says Paul to Timothy. Now, you see how beautifully all-encompassing those three metaphors were. Only if he was strong in each of these different aspects would his work of keeping the heritage of the truth be successful. And Paul knew with all his heart that if the son of the faith thought about it deeply, he would be given the understanding he needed. What Timothy was going to have to learn, brothers and sisters, which I think, by the way, is exactly what we have to learn, is for this moment right now, this problem, this issue in the ecclesia, in the family, in the brotherhood, for this particular circumstance, what do I need to be? Do I need to be a soldier, or an athlete, or a farmer? Do I need courage and endurance, or effort and excellence, or nurture and perseverance? What does this circumstance call upon me to do in being strong? What am I facing here? In what way must I be strong now? And to a young man filled with uncertainty, brothers and sisters, subject to physical ailments and smitten with a timid and retiring disposition, such an unlikely candidate to be the truth's hero and the truth champion, to that young man, but in whose heart the truth burns so strong and so bright, Paul says, learn these three and you will be strong. You'll be God's instrument, just as each one of us are called to be. And I suggest, brothers and sisters, that answering those questions in our own work and the truth service will help us to know in what way we should be strong on different occasions. It's all about what will be best for the truth. What will be best for the truth is not always the same. The circumstance will demand that we choose the right way towards the right outcome. Should we be the soldier? Should we be the athlete? Or should we be the farmer? And who was all this written to, brothers and sisters, this counsel? Why, to Paul's beloved son. And his admonition to Timothy reminds us that God the Father sent his own son, made strong for himself. And Christ went forth to guard and to continue his Father's work in just the same way that Paul was asking Timothy now to do of his. See, all his life, Paul had been so inspired by Christ's courage to endure suffering like a soldier, and so amazed at Christ's determination to agonize with effort like an athlete, and so moved at Christ's toil to bring forth fruit in others like a farmer, that he committed his life to following his Lord. And now he will ask Timothy to follow him as he had followed Christ. And I think, brothers and sisters, as we just reflect upon these few verses in the 2nd of Timothy chapter 2, be strong. It teaches us that we are part of the continuum of the truth. From Moses to David to Paul to ourselves. The truth has never changed. We're not at liberty to change it. We're here to guard it. And what we've got to know is that by the time we come to pass it on to others, that what we are passing on is the same heritage that we received, that we have not compromised it, that we have not diluted it, that we've not altered it, and most of all, that we have not abandoned it. The truth is not ours to change, brothers and sisters. The truth is ours to guard. And if the truth is lost, it will be either because those passing on the charge have failed to realize its importance, or because those receiving the charge have failed to appreciate its preciousness. You see, Joshua was asked to complete the conquest of the land and to oversee its settlement, but what he would really do was continue a work which Moses had already begun. And Solomon was asked to build the house of God and finalize its system of worship, but what he would really do was continue a work which David had begun. And Timothy was asked to confirm the ecclesias and provide pastoral care, but what he would really do is continue a work which Paul had begun. And even that which Moses had begun and David had begun and Paul had begun in their own time was only because someone else had passed the heritage to them also. So ask yourself this question, brothers. This is a couple of questions to close. So what do you think the greatest challenges are that the ecclesia will face to guard the heritage of the truth? And how will you be strong to help preserve it? See, this is something that every generation's got to ask themselves. What do you think the challenges are in your generation? Every generation's different, by the way. Every generation faces different challenges to Yahweh's heritage. What are they in your time? And how will you be strong to help preserve the charge when that challenge comes upon you? This is a question that we have all got to ask, brothers and sisters. And here's another one like unto it, which is, what is the heritage of the truth with regard to doctrine or reading or music or fellowship or marriage or conduct or separation or ecclesial life? What's the heritage of the truth? Well, the one thing that's certain, brothers and sisters, is that if we don't know what that heritage is, then we cannot guard it. So that's the challenge, isn't it? Do you and I know what the heritage of the truth is? And each of these things, that's the first prerequisite to faithful guardianship. So let's make pledge that we will capture the spirit of the counsel to this young man, and that we will be strong to continue a work that's already begun well before us. And we are simply asked to carry it forward and pass it on faithfully to a generation to come. In the words of a hymn that says, "My God, my Father, make me strong. When tasks of life seem hard and long, to greet them with this triumph song, thy will be done. Draw from my timid eyes the veil to show where earthly forces fail, thy power and love must still prevail. Thy will be done."